There are 1,000 school districts in California and almost 10,000 schools serving more than 6 million students. Most of our schools were built more than 25 years ago, and many of those more than 50 years ago. Right now, California is being challenged as it continues to grow to address school building needs. Today on this program, a panel of experts will discuss the issue of California's aging K-12 school building infrastructure and focus the discussion upon the need for state bond funding. We'll address the need to repair and upgrade existing schools to meet the building codes and educational standards of today. And we'll look at the need for new schools in the future. Our experts will also discuss the lack of technology in our aging schools and the lack of funding for this technology. This deficiency comes at a time when the legislature and governor are expecting technology to be present in our schools for statewide student testing on computers. We'll also discuss local school construction bonds and how those are required to match state bond funds for building and repairing our schools. With us today are 4 highly experienced school leaders representing the Bay Area, Sacramento, the Central Valley, and Southern California. Let me introduce our experts. Joe Dixon is the Assistant Superintendent for Facilities and Governmental Relations for the Santa Ana Unified School District. Joe is the current chair for CASH, the Coalition for Adequate School Housing. Jenny Hanna is the Chief Facilities Officer for the Kern County Superintendent of Schools Office. She's been an executive board member for the Coalition for Adequate School Housing since January 2009 and is currently vice chair of the organization. Timothy White is the Associate Superintendent of Facilities Planning and Management for the Oakland Unified School District. He is the current chair of the Coalition for Adequate School Housing's Urban Committee. Kathy Allen is the Assistant Superintendent of Facilities Support Services for the Sacramento City Unified School District. Kathy is the immediate past chair of CASH. Thank you all for being with us today to talk about this very timely and important topic. Let me start off by saying that there are greater demands on education today. There are some new approaches to how we're approaching coursework, and of course, we all know about expectations by students and by parents. So let me start with a kind of overview, and let me start with you, if I might, Joe. Give me some details as to the condition or the conditions that you see statewide in infrastructure in our schools today.
Okay, thanks, Jim. There's still great needs in our schools, although we've accomplished a lot over the last 12, 14 years. I think the most significant study that has come out recently is from UC Berkeley Center for Cities and Schools, which identified $117 billion in needs in California schools. And that's both for new construction and modernization. And that's just bringing schools, our current schools, up to the current code and current standards that we all expect.
With demands like that, what kind of condition do districts find themselves in terms of what they need to get done and how they need to go forward? Let me move on to you, Jenny.
So Jim, for an example, in our county, we had a district who had recently done some major renovations in the state school facilities program and had done it within the last, 3 years. Mm-hmm. And they happened to be a base school, and they had some money available to them from the military to come out and help them with some renovations. They were listed as one of the highest in need schools within the United States for those renovation and repairs after having already gone through our state program. And then although it's a great program and it's been successful in making those monies available to lots of school districts, it hasn't gone far enough in terms of educational renovation and taking into account the age of the facility and the real renovations that need to take place for those repairs.
How does this impact the kids? How does this impact the educational process?
I think the important thing to remember when we talk about facilities is that facilities are imperative to the educational process, and particularly in certain environments where, as Jenny mentioned, you have an aged, old inventory. school buildings, those buildings in themselves inherently can't address the type of 21st century needs that other buildings can that have the type of amenities that you need. And so in this particular case, I think urban type school districts that have older infrastructures have a greater need that's not being met.
And Kathy, I've got to imagine that whether you're in an urban environment or a suburban environment or a rural environment, as we said at the beginning, some of these schools are 25 years old, some of these are 50 years old. That says something about the scope of work that needs to be done.
Correct. Yeah, I actually have buildings, school sites that are over 100 years old.
Wow.
So our recently completed Sustainable Facilities Master Plan, we refer to it as, identified $2 billion in need throughout Sacramento City Unified, which is a fairly large district, at least up here in Northern California. We have over 70 sites. So a huge need as we keep hearing an aging infrastructure. And one of the things that we encounter as we try and bring these buildings up to code is just the amount of money that it takes to just do the bare bones minimum to bring things up to compliance. And sometimes we don't actually ever able to get into the classroom.
Well, let's talk about changes for just a moment, because we all know that this year a relatively new educational program, is to be launched that's going to be focused on a number of things, one of which students who are poor, students for whom English is a second language, and foster care youth. Now, give me a sense of the districts that serve these populations. How are they going to meet the expectations of Common Core, which is one of those, and then local control funding without a state bond, without a larger issue in making sure that we have enough money to get things done? Let me start with you, Tim.
I think that there's a complexity associated with the Common Core that I think many school districts are going to struggle to try to accommodate. The Common Core is associated with a testing standard that requires that schools have a pretty robust infrastructure. That infrastructure is internet-based type of an infrastructure, and so the standard for testing will be a standard that all kids across the state have to have readiness for. We believe that the readiness for that testing is the same type of readiness you actually need for the instructional framework. And so we don't want to have our kids tested on a framework for testing that they haven't prepared for instructionally. So urban school districts are going to be so far behind in terms of readiness because aged infrastructures don't have the type of amenities and that the Common Core requires, much less the smarter balanced assessment testing that the Common Core requires.
So what about in your situation?
Well, in areas like ours, Central California, lots of geographic area to cover, and so rural areas, you know, there isn't internet coverage, and there isn't a pipe, as they call it, and so putting up towers, getting microwave dishes for connectivity to some of the really remote areas of our region is a costly thing to do, and you know, the structure's not in place to do that. So
that's going to impact where you go with
Right.
regard to Common Core.
Right.
Joe?
Well, we went from a funding model called revenue limit to LCFF, local control funding formula, that was never intended to replace a capital facility program such as a state bond. And actually, if we had a state bond and we had access to funds to complement the LCFF funding, we could provide for our students the way that it's intended. And what I mean by that, there's a class size reduction component within LCFF, which means you have to add facilities, add classrooms, add teachers. So as we talk about Common Core in LCFF, I think it's important to remember that's a funding model to teach students. It's not a capital facility model.
Sure. So in simple terms, can you kind of outline the funding sources that districts have today, the funding sources that are available to schools to address the infrastructure needs that we're talking about?
Up until about 2006, or actually more recently, we have relied heavily on the state school facility building program, which is a state general obligation bond that districts can access if they are eligible for new construction or modernization funding. Locally, we also have the same opportunities to pass general obligation bonds within our district boundaries. We also have a couple of other taxing mechanisms that we could do. There's basically 4 major ones, parcel taxes included, but they all require you know, an affirmative vote of our voters. The percentage depends again on that type of measure. We do access federal funds from time to time, but they're fairly targeted dollars for specific programs. And if you're lucky enough to fall into one of those programs, then you might be able to access that funding.
When we hear the term bonding capacity, because this often comes into the discussion, what does that mean to a school district? And does it mean that money is available now because bonding capacity exists?
Bonding capacity by itself is really the maximum amount of general obligation bond debt an agency, or in this case a school district, can have outstanding at any one time. So for example, Sacramento City has a couple of bond measures totaling about $414 million, which is wonderful. Thank the voters very much for allowing us to have the opportunity to spend that money on their facilities. Our first bond sale was in 2013, and it was roughly $68 million. So our bond sales are based on property values and assessed valuation of the properties that are within our district. So a lot of it depends on the economy at the time. And then the second major piece of that is what we promised to the voters when we did our bond election. So in our case, we said that we would never tax them more than $54 for $100,000 worth of assessed valuation.
So a contingency here.
Yeah, there's limits, there's statutory limits, and then there's local limits that we impose on ourselves in order to get a bond passed. So a lot of money available, but not right now.
Okay, and Joe?
You know, with the recession and the decrease in assessed value, many districts had a very tough time selling bonds and meeting the promise to the taxpayers, because typically you go out with a bond measure and you have a range, or you even have a set number of how much it's going to cost per $100,000. So when assessed values dropped, you couldn't meet that promise to the voters. And rather than sell bonds and break that promise, districts just didn't move forward on their bond sales.
I would imagine, if you thought about it, this is a little bit like budgeting for your home. You know, I need X amount of dollars, but what's it going to cost me to take out that loan from the bank? What's it going to cost me to access those dollars? Tim, would you say that's a fair?
I think that's a fair assessment. Recently, my school district, Oakland Unified, actually passed a general obligation bond of $475 million by about 85% of the voters. And actually, after that was passed, it passed in November 2012, we weren't able to access that money even though it was officially approved by the voters and available to us, because we were not able to get a satisfactory Standard & Poor's and Moody bond rating. And so given the district's rating at this time, that money was not available to us even though it was approved by the voters.
Interesting. The Coalition for Adequate School Housing, or CASH, and the California Building Society, Building Industry Association rather, conducted a poll with voters. And I want to talk about that for just a moment. The poll, as I understand it, was taken to better understand whether or not people in California would be more likely to realize there was a concern and address that concern. Joe, give me a sense of what the result was from the poll.
Tremendous support for schools throughout the state and across all demographics for school facilities, for a state school facility bond. We had over 60% support, which is tremendous. People in the state believe that schools still need money, and the schools still need to be repaired, and that there's a big need to make sure that our kids are in schools that are safe and healthy and ready for kids for education. And so it came across as a tremendous amount of support that showed that if we had a state bond on the ballot, it would pass.
Let me ask each of you, what do you hear from parents and educators in each of your districts? Jenny, what are you hearing from the grassroots, as it were?
You know, I think that we locally have shown that we support with bond measures and with all the projects that we do. The local dollars have been there to support the projects and things, and I think that when the state comes through with the funding in a program like we have today, that only helps leverage those local dollars so that that makes the project better. It has a unifying effect across the state, so we have, you know, a little more equity in terms of what happens in Santa Ana versus what happens in Kern County. I think that our parents and our teachers kind of see that state involvement as that unifying effect. So.
Tim?
I think it's important to actually say I believe it's a state obligation to help address facilities needs across the entire state of California. As the state of California requires that we send our kids to school, the state of California has always in the past ponied up the funds associated with facilities. And so as we now come into this era of local control funding formula and what appears to be a movement to shift the burden of finance to local municipalities, I see in my community a little pushback. At a certain point, you can actually fatigue a local municipality's ability to fund those things. And in the case of Oakland, where voters have been extremely generous, we're desperate for the state match. And I've got $500 million at my disposal, but we have $1.5 billion of need. And so that community in Oakland is really, really looking for the state to pony up and provide its share.
Kathy, your input.
I think from the local perspective, what I'm hearing is similar to what you asked before. How come we're not doing it all right now? You know, how come we're not running out there with 100 projects and spending all the money? So there's been a lot of education that has to happen at the local level. And then trying to, again, explain to folks about some of this money we do want to leverage with state money. And in the past, you know, the money that we raise locally is required to be used as a match to access state funding. So we anticipate that that program will look a little different as we move forward. But you know, you don't want to miss an opportunity to access state funding when it is there.
You've all talked about a state bond, and talk a little bit about that, but also give me a little historical perspective, because I want people to understand that this isn't all a new concept that we're coming up with here, and why it's important now, and why the state bond, sort of in conjunction or despite local bond availability, is really needed at this moment in time.
Well, since 1982, pretty much every 2 years there's been a state bond. It's the primary source of funding for school facilities in California up until 2006. So from 1982 to 2006, we had state bond money consistently. With the recession, we understand there hasn't been a bond, but you know, that dries up that primary source and creates an equity issue for many, many districts, as we've been talking about. And so the state has a commitment in their constitution to provide the money for educating the kids in the state, and the students of the state. And we're trying to provide those facilities to make sure that our kids are prepared for college or career, and that we're competitive as a state, both with other states and internationally. I think it's very, very important for the state to step forward.
Jenny, let me get your input on this.
So really, it's kind of that same language we're all talking about. The difference in wealth between school districts in the state of California is kind of the primary reason I feel why the state should be involved in a facilities program. They're really the backbone and have been the backbone of providing this match. And in some cases, when there's a hardship district, when local funds, there's not an ability to raise up the match, they become, you know, the 100% funding for the school facilities. So it's an equity equation, you know, an opportunity for all the kids in California to have this equitable situation. And the facilities are an important part of the education process. It's not just the building they go into. It is a part of the learning environment, and it's integral to their experience. So very important.
Tim?
And nothing's more important, I think, to a kid than culture and conditions, right? When you go to school in Oakland, you know, my kids walk past needle parks, they walk past drug dealers, they go through threatening neighborhoods and environments, and when they get to school, I want them to be in a school that's safe, that they're comfortable in, and that they can actually get some quality education. And so whenever you talk about school facilities, you have to talk about children. And when we talk about children, you're talking about people's livelihoods. And so the issue of the state being in education is an issue of equity, because other than that, even in Oakland, where the community has put up well over $1.5 billion to address facilities needs is still drastically short of what our need is. And even in my own district, the separation in terms of academic performance between the haves and have-nots is huge. And it can only be balanced with, some additional support by the state as it's provided in the past.
Kathy?
So you've heard us kind of say over and over that the need is overwhelming, and it truly is overwhelming. The need for a state bond will help us in maintaining and keeping our facilities operating at an adequate level. I think what's happened is, our deferred maintenance funding has gone away. As we've gone through our budget cuts, and it's always keep it as far away from the classroom as possible. And so our operating systems, our infrastructure, our basic, the roof, the building envelope, they've suffered. They really have. We haven't had the deferred maintenance money that we used to have to be able to maintain those. So now we're running to fail, as we say, which is really a sad state of affairs. If I had some maintenance money to be able to maintain some of those systems, then I wouldn't have to replace them as soon. So having that state bond will allow us to do that, those major renovation projects that will keep those systems running, operating longer.
You want to say something, Jim?
Right now, after not having a bond for 8 years and not having other funding sources to maintain our schools, we're getting to that point where it's critical, where we're going to have major breakdowns and major failures. So the time to act is now. If we delay it any longer, we're just putting ourselves in jeopardy, and it's going to cost more.
Yeah.
I want to ask, if you were speaking to the governor, if you were speaking to the legislative leadership at this moment in time, and they were here, what would you say to them to support this infrastructure school needs issue at this time?
Obviously, the protection of the investment in our existing infrastructure is really important fiscally. Joe just mentioned costs a lot more to take care of something in the future than it would be to spend the pennies today to fix those things. But I would have to say that would want to have a better long-term plan that California really should be seen as a model for education, and encourage us to have facilities that are 21st century learning facilities, that we can do some things educationally with those facilities, and that we're just not about just the buildings, but it's about creating those environments for the kids that is a good experience, that enhances the learning, and we know that those things happen in good facilities. So. And
Tim, what would you say to the governor and the legislative leadership?
Jerry Brown used to actually be governor. He's the governor of California now, but used to be the mayor of Oakland. And so Jerry Brown, he knows I need to build a new Fremont High School. He knows I need to build a new Castlemont High School. He knows I need to build a new McClymonds High School. Those schools are antiquated and they're in very bad condition, and they really need to be repaired. And putting new high schools in those communities will do tremendous things for those communities in terms of educating the residents there, right? And bringing kids back to schools that they don't go to now because the schools are in such poor condition. And so as opposed to the broader appeal to Jerry Brown, I would appeal to Jerry Brown's Oakland hometown roots and say, you're aware of what our needs are there and that you can help us, and so we beseech you to help.
Kathy?
I think the frustrating part for me and my colleagues as well, I'm sure, is that now we are in direct competition with dollars that go into the classroom. And guess who's going to lose when you talk about something to help a teacher with a program or something to go help fix a roof. So it's frustrating that we're now in this competition for those LCFF dollars. So if we could go back to the days again when we had deferred maintenance funding, that certainly was maybe more of a level playing field. So a little bit more understanding about what that truly means to put all that control down at the local level.
Well, this is a topic that I'm sure many people have been informed about by our discussion today, and it's a topic that many may not even know the importance of, and how desperate we are in some areas for that infrastructure money. So I want to thank you all for your input, and thank you for giving us your insights and your expertise on an issue which is going to be even more important as we move along in educating our children and with changes in the classroom today. So thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We hope this has been both interesting and informative for you. For more information on the topics covered in our discussion, please visit the Coalition for Adequate School Housing's website at cashnet.org. And for the latest California school facility news, go to cashfacilitiesnews.org. Thanks for being with us.